Gary Coons, who's the MLA, lives in Prince Rupert, and I think is well known here. He's a former teacher, so we really have to watch his 10 minutes.
Thank you, and at least I'm not a lawyer. Chiefs and elders, respected guests, friends, and my good friend, Commissioner Opal, thank you for coming in. Commissioner Commission Council, thank you so much for coming to our community. And thank you for giving people the opportunity to have a say and say a few words and express a few emotions. It is very trying on a lot of us who have been involved in this for a while, and I've been here 34 years and taught and tried to understand what's happening in the community, in the region, and all of a sudden somebody goes missing, and not much to follow up, and then it goes on and it goes on, and then somehow I got into politics, and all of a sudden, you know, it's a huge issue when you start looking at everything in perspective. And quite often you spend your time looking at trying to get economic development going and looking at fishing issues and road closures and this and that. But it comes down to the heart of our communities, I believe, in why we're gathered here today and throughout this whole study commission. We all know that the saying that it takes a community to raise a child. But when you lose a child, you know, it rips the heart out of the community. And when you lose a child, you lose a sister, a niece, a grandchild, you know, or somebody that you've known for many years or not so many years. It really has a huge impact. And we've been seeing this happen in this region for many years. And thank you for coming to the communities to hear the stories. Even though the stories have already been told, and we talked about the symposium back in 2006. And sometimes you wonder, like, how many times that you need to take a march or have a vigil or walk to Ottawa or walk to communities throughout the north and throughout the province to raise awareness. You know, the likes of Gladys Raddick and Bernie Williams, you know, I've walked with many times. And I'm up here and I start to say, well, it's pretty, you know, heartwarming that to lead the session off, you know, besides my good friend Murray, but I'm not too sure if I'm the right person. You know, I went to the symposium back in 2006 with 500 delegates, 90 organizations. I dragged along a couple of my colleagues and MLAs, Rupert from Surrey Leawood and Diane from Coquitlam, who couldn't hold back the tears when we heard the stories for the 2 days and heard what had been happening along the highway for so many years. And there was a call for action, and we're going to be talking to symposiums. And I'm going to try to keep the questions, Commissioner Opal. So being a teacher, I did my homework, and I got everything here, and I'm a bit restricted here because I like to have that table in front of me. But again, there were 33 recommendations dealing with 4 areas: victim prevention, emergency planning and team response, victim family counseling and support, and community development and support. And these were developed and brought out there, and people had hopes and dreams that we could work towards something as communities and as a region to draw the recommendations in to help make a difference. And you know, it's very hard to go back and see where we've gone from 2006 and 5 years later to today. You know, and I do remember we were doing a Take Back the Highway in 2005 in our community, and then 4 days later, a young woman went missing from Prince Rupert. And you start to wonder that there was a lot of work to do back then, and there's even more to do now. You know, when we look back at the numbers, you know, at first there were 9, then it was updated to 18. Lots of groups say there's 32 missing women along here. Aboriginal leaders say up to 43. along the 724-kilometer highway. You know, and all victims between 14 and 25, and the majority of them hitchhiking. And the vast majority, young Aboriginal women. And when we look at the vulnerability of the victims, you know, the most significant factor, I believe, and most people I talk to, is poverty. And young women are put at risk simply because there's no other way, no other transportation option to get around except hitchhiking. There's little money, vehicles are luxury, and lots of families and First Nation communities have a higher percentage and are living at poverty levels than anywhere, you know, in the province. And there's a growing gap between the rich and the poor and child poverty. And the most significant factor in my mind is poverty, is the basis for the young women being vulnerable. And another factor, and again, I'm doing the questions that we talked about, vulnerability, just in case somebody's trying to follow me, is geography and the lack of public transportation. And you know, whether it's for business or appointments, whether it's recreation, whether it's visiting friends or relatives, or going to other communities where goods or services are needed in the nearest town or city. You know, there's no public transportation in many, if not all of the First Nations communities and villages throughout the north. And there's no public transportation system along Highway 16. And when we look at some of the recommendations, one of the key recommendations from this symposium back in 2006 was to develop a public transportation network so that people who are vulnerable, young men, young women, elders, families can travel from community to community or to cities and towns. And I think a lack of the social supports is a key component here also. Now, one of the other questions when we look at how can the police...
I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that it is a bit of a cultural norm in some of the small villages for people to go and hitchhike because everybody knows everybody else. And it may be that some of the young ladies that are going into the bigger communities outside of their villages may still think it is a cultural norm, oh, we'll just go and hitchhike because they are accustomed to it and just simply are not aware of the dangers that are there.
There, yes. And that was one of the key components of the recommendations, was an awareness campaign in high schools and without. Now, I do want to acknowledge, I'm not too sure how to handle questions to me at this point in time. Perhaps at the end. Yeah, Tom, I guess I'm here.
If somebody's going to speak, my name's Tom Chow. If someone's going to speak, could they just tell people who they are, just so we can put it in context?
Oh yes, I'm sorry, my name is Monica and I'm a local resident of Prince Rupert.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks, Tom. And again, when I get into the second component of some of the questions that we're looking at is how can police or RCMP take this and vulnerability into account? Well, I think there's a lot of mistrust that has built up over the years with relationships between First Nations and the RCMP. And Mary Teegee, who is the Director of Child and Family Services for Carrier Security Family Services, recently said that the police RCMP have made the efforts, but they still need to step it up. There's a long history, this is a quote, there's a long history where people have felt they can't trust the RCMP. She said, we haven't felt supported, and there's a long way to go. You know, but in this case, with what's going on right now, she says they've made the efforts, but it's just baby steps. And I think that that's a huge component of trust that is lacking in the communities along the Highway of Tears. And when we look at some of the recommendations, again, from the Highway of Tears Symposium, recommendation number 5 under victim support basically said that the RCMP had re-established and maintained communications with each other, with each of the victims' families. And at that time, 5 years ago, there was a strong feeling that there was not support among the families and the RCMP. And I hope that's improved. Like, I don't really know some of the status of the recommendations, and I don't think I'm privy to some of them. Another recommendation that the First Nation advocate be provided to bridge the long-standing communications and awareness gap which exists between the RCMP and First Nations victims' families. So I think there's a long way to build that trust and create meaningful bonds between First Nations and the RCMP. Some of the issues might be the movement of officers, you know, and not staying in communities long and not really having, developing a real portrait of a certain community, and gaining that First Nations trust and insight. So, and again, when we look at some of the past, whether it's the Frank Paul case and the inquiry, or the Judge Ramsey, or the Picton, there's some real questions out there where the First Nations have been getting the support. And I think what we're seeing right now in the next couple of months is a real opportunity for us to speak about our concerns again. I'm going to get to, I'm trying to check my time here. I'm sure Wally's going to give me the hook here. But when we look at the progress in the Highway of Tears recommendations, very few of them, in my mind, have been implemented. There was a lot of transportation issues, and you know, whether it's public transportation or working with Greyhound bus line to look at dealing with hitchhikers. There was RCMP who have now changed their protocol. And they stop hitchhikers and try to get information. So there has been some change in their RCMP protocol, which is a huge step. But again, there's lots of other things like emergency phone booths along the highway, you know, and small things that could be done that have never been acted upon. And billboards along the highway, and posters, and lots of things to create awareness. And in Prince Rupert, we do not have a Highway of Tears sign. We've been working on one for over 2.5 years. And there's actually a poster contest happening that I'm with the Transition House sponsoring in the next month or two, in conjunction with Take Back the Highway in October, and trying to get that awareness and publicity out there about the dangers of hitchhiking. Emergency readiness plan hasn't been done. First Nations crisis response plan. The legacy fund, a Highway of Tears legacy fund that would, you know, look towards creating programs and creating awareness in schools and communities, and I don't think that's quite there yet. There was a commitment, or there's a recommendation to hire 2 coordinators for the Highway of Tears, one at both ends of the highway, to coordinate activities and ensure that recommendations were followed. Also, a board of directors who looked at coordinating, hopefully, an annual symposium of Highway of Tears, so that we can look at where we've been, where we are, and where we need to go. So on that note, I'm really honored to be here and again take, you know, a bit of time to look at my issues, the concerns that I've heard, and try to answer some questions, and look at, as I said before, that you know, it takes a community to raise a child, and rips the heart out of a community when we lose one. And that's what's been happening for so long along our highway and our communities. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind, I'd like to pose a few questions to you all. Could you help us please with some of these recommendations that were obviously the result of a great deal of work, energy committed by people in the community. We know that you were there. And I know that some of these recommendations you're not going to have answers to. Perhaps we can discuss how to get some help with that. But simple things that you've mentioned. To your knowledge, has the shuttle bus idea that was recommendation number 1, has that been implemented?
No, and what happened is the symposium was in 2006. A progress report came out about 15 months later in 2007, and they looked at having some people organize awareness campaigns and getting some billboards along the highway that we've seen. And since 2007, the funding has dried up, and basically, when I talked to somebody in the Carrier-Sicani Nation who was looking after this beside their desk with volunteers, basically said that in communities where you have volunteers, it basically gets rich communities, and nobody's rich around here to volunteer. So the long answer to that would be no, I don't think it's been followed up above.
Right. The second one is there was a concept of the RCMP not driving by hitchhikers, rather stopping and just inquiring and making sure that someone's safety was assured. Do you know if there's been any change to an implementation of that recommendation?
I'm under the impression that, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but the protocol has been changed where RCMP will stop hitchhikers, try to get some information if they can, and advise them of the dangers and start a conversation
Thank you. Let me ask you another one about the hitchhiking issue. There was a recommendation in your report 06 you participated with about increasing patrol during the hitchhiking season. Do you know if there's been any implementation or increased patrol during what's known as hitchhiking season?
I'm unaware of that, so I can't answer that question.
I wanted to ask you about safe homes. There was also an interesting recommendation about that. Has that recommendation been implemented as far as you know?
As far as I know, I would say no.
Okay. You actually mentioned the emergency phone system, which took into account the fact that cell phones often don't work in areas that we're talking about. I gather from your comments that has not been implemented yet.
No.
I wanted to ask you about another recommendation, and that was the timelines on when someone is first reported missing, and in your symposium report there was a recommendation about a more structured approach to timelines from the time of someone's reported missing until when there's going to be more intensive follow-up. Do you know if there's been any change there?
Yeah, there was a recommendation about a regional First Nations crisis response plan, and then a First Nations crisis response team. And I would have to say, I'm unsure, but I don't think so.
Okay, that's fine. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about, there was a recommendation in terms of the awareness program, and you mentioned that with signage and that. Has there been any increased signage that you're aware of in the last couple of years?
Yes, yeah, from Prince George, I believe, to Terrace, there's, and somebody helped me, probably 5 or 6 signs that have about 4 signs.
New Hampshire.
Okay, and we're in the process, hopefully, of getting one from Prince Rupert.
Well, finally, just let me say on behalf of the commission, we know that you're intimately involved and care a lot about this. If as we're doing our work, if you have any comments or assistance you think you can provide or information around the symposium, I think you feel free to get in touch with us. We're grateful for that.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, sir, when you talked about, did you say toll? Like your question concerned something about the hitchhiking season? I couldn't hear you, and I was back here reacted to, we couldn't figure out what you were saying.
There was reference in the symposium to a hitchhiking season and increasing the awareness around that, perhaps increasing patrols.
Patrols. P, with a P, patrols, okay.
Patrols, yes.
Okay, and that means people like citizen patrol kind of thing?
It means the kind of increased patrols that were discussed in the symposium report, just because of the fact there's a recognition there's a greater amount of vulnerable people hitchhiking during
Patrols, RCMP, you mean?
Yes.
Okay, like numbers?
Sorry?
Numbers, like is it usual patrols, like going back and forth?
Well, I'm referencing the report, sir.
I'm talking about here. In reference to here.
Well, I'm just not quite sure. Maybe we can discuss that after.
Well, I'm just trying to answer a question for the rest of the people here. Is that
I'm just not sure, but let's discuss that at a break and we can clarify that.
I'm looking at patrols between here and Terrace,
Okay.
right? You know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coots. Good job. Good review. We have now Brian, yeah?
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Gary Bard. I'm the Stopping Environments Counselor for the North Coast Transition Society. The North Coast Transition Society is a not-for-profit organization that provides services for hundreds of women and children survivors of violence in Rupert and surrounding areas. And this includes the 4 surrounding villages, Hardy Bay, Catla, and Martons. Sorry. Got better? Nervous. Some of the programs and services that we offer include the Transition House, a women's outreach program, a housing outreach program, a supportive recovery program, and several community-based support groups. I speak on behalf today of the Society and on behalf of some of the women who access our services. We wish to make 2 points today. Our first point, or more like question we ask, is why are the cases of the missing women of the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia now being combined with the cases of the missing women of the downtown east side? We're talking here of 2 completely different geographic locations with different circumstances for women going missing. Is this the government saving money? A 2-for-1 deal? When one considers the fact that British Columbia has the highest number of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada, it is shameful that the unique situation of northern British Columbia and its numerous Aboriginal communities, which bears no similarity to Vancouver's east side, be lumped in with it for what appears to be convenience and only increases the perception that Victoria not only doesn't understand the North, but neglects it. So we ask that there be 2 separate inquiries held, one for the missing women of the downtown east side and one for the missing women of the Highway of Tears. Our second point we wish to make is in regards to the government's refusal to provide legal funding for the community groups that have been granted standing at the inquiry. Whereas it is, of course, imperative that the families of the missing women have been granted full standing with full funding, they do not complete the voices of all of the marginalized women in British Columbia. Many of the missing voices would have been heard then to the community groups that had been granted standing. However, it is shocking to hear that these community groups will not be provided with legal funding and therefore they had to withdraw participation in the inquiry. This refusal to provide the legal funding is ironic in 2 ways. Firstly, it is ironic because the police and Crown Council have access to unlimited legal funds. This is ironic because they are pretty much the very ones whose actions are under question with regard to how they handled the cases of the missing women. Secondly, it is ironic because the main purpose of this inquiry, to our understanding, is to hear the voices of the marginalized women. And by silencing the community groups that speak on behalf of hundreds of programs that speak on behalf of thousands of marginalized women, the government has nearly completely silenced the very voices of the inquiry had intended to hear. To illustrate, ourselves as the North Coast Transition Society was established in the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia with granted standing, and because of their support to our programs, they knew the stories of some of the marginalized women of our area. It is also ironic because these are the very community groups that pushed for years for an inquiry to take place. So we ask, if the government is going to hold an inquiry, we ask that it's done properly and in an ethical manner. Considering the gravity of this inquiry, one would think that no stone would go unturned and as much input as possible would be sought. If the right voices, the voices of the marginalized women of British Columbia, are not heard, the result of the inquiry will be an incomplete and insufficient report with too many questions remaining unanswered because enough were asked. So in closing, I know you will be traveling from here to Terre and onwards down the highway. and I'm sure you will marvel at how beautiful and breathtaking it is along Highway 16. I'm sure you won't think it shocking that we hold the five pictures.
You want to break and come back later?
No, it's okay, I'm almost done. So I hope that Victoria rethinks its position and allows for an inquiry with unmoved knowledge given and power, and that no more tears will be shed.
Thank you.